So welcome everybody to our third Backstage community meeting. Today we've got a few items to run through. You can find the agenda on this link that I'm just dropping into chat now. So that's where the agenda is. I will just share my screen so we can take a quick look at the agenda. Where are we? Here we go. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see what's on there. So for today's meeting, we are going to, GoInd is going to give us a little bit of a demo and discussion around what they're doing at Zalando with Backstage. So that's what we're going to be jumping into first shortly. We then have a question. The main question that's been upvoted this time around is about RBAC and what's the future of that with Backstage. So as we jump into the questions, I'll kind of hand these out to the maintainers, the other sponsors, or myself, and we can run through that. But please, everybody, jump in and take part. So there was this topic from Splunk about wanting to hear about how other companies have deployed Backstage on Kubernetes, or if they use Kubernetes to deploy Backstage. There's some answers that I know people have dropped into the agenda here, but we can ask that question more widely in the community, and feel free to jump into that discussion. Okay, we've got a question around squad and teams that we can dive into. We can talk about what we do at Spotify there. And then we've got a specific issue called out down at the bottom here, or two specific issues to look at, one relating to manage and ownership, and one around the scaffolder there. If there are other questions or things like that, there's two places you can drop them. Feel free if you want to add a topic to the agenda in GitHub, or by all means use the chat functionality here in Zoom, and we'll keep an eye on that for questions coming in that we can answer as we go through. But without ado, to kick things off, GoInd, I've seen you on the call. Are you good to go to talk to us about Backstage at Zalando?
Yeah, I guess I'm more or less ready.
Great stuff. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start sharing my screen. Hold on. So good afternoon, everybody, or morning, evening, whatever is in your time zone. So my name is Govind, and I'm part of this team called Pitchfork or Developer Console in Zalando. So we maintain the developer tooling for the developers in Zalando. And what we have here is what we call Project Sunrise, which is based on Backstage. And this is a rethinking of our existing developer console using Backstage as a platform for providing tooling to all software developers and others within Zalando. So my agenda is simple. So I provide a little bit of context about our history and where we were and where we started and what we're doing. And then a little bit of our story. And then in the story, we will talk about like, what was our journey? How did we use Backstage and what did we learn? And then what are the next steps? So here it goes. So history. So we had an existing developer console. So this was one of the starting points for developers. And this is where we provided developer-based tooling. So this was like a front-end SPA. And then we had each of our providers who would provide us tooling in forms of micro frontends. So for example, we would have a CI/CD team, which provides continuous integration and deployment through pipelines. And this was provided as a micro frontend. And we had we developed in-house technology for this. It was called Mosaic. And basically Mosaic was a JavaScript framework where you could provide micro frontends, and then they would talk to each other using some window postmatches and other technologies. And there were a couple of other backend technologies as well, but all of them are part of the Mosaic framework. So why move away from the existing developer console? So developer console was conceived, I think, about like 2015, 2016, and it was online since 2017. And while the idea was like we would provide some sort of a UI where other teams could provide tooling, It was not as easy as we thought it would be, and the learning curve was too high, and it was based on JavaScript. So it was quite tricky for providers, especially for teams which did not have front-end developers to provide their tooling. And the learning curve was really high, and it was not easily composable. Like there was no way for us, for example, to provide some sort of it was not easy to like have front ends and like widgets that can interrupt and then like fit in seamlessly, and it was not possible to share components as well, for example. So if I develop some sort of a widget, it was not possible for me to provide it to other teams who could then use it easily. And because of these problems, it generated a fragmented internal developer tooling. So what happened was, like, since the learning curve was too high, people were not inclined to provide all of them through the developer console, and resulted to some fragmentation. So we decided to move away from developer console in order to have it much easier for other teams to provide tooling. It should also be composable and shareable. Also, it would lead to like a standardization of our patterns and architecture. So for example, if we have new people who want to provide tooling, they don't have to sit around and try to figure out what are the best patterns to like how to shape their software. You just have a template that you can copy paste and then make changes and you're good to go. So we decided to provide, and this is what we intend to provide. So, and also discoverable, usable, and it's collaborative. So we figured out like if these are what would help make developers happy and more productive. And these were sort of the high level goals or the vision of the platform that we intend to build. And and what Backstage offers Zalando. So Backstage had a lot of advantages for us. One was it centralized all tooling information and access to resources. Basically, it was like one location where all developers could come in and then just access all the things they need. And then they don't have to like jump from one location to another, which is important for us because it decreased the cognitive overload. And then there was like one place where you could go to if you want something related to the software in Zalando. And this content was consistent, accessible, and most importantly, beautiful. Like visually, it was very pleasing. And as much as we are developers, I think aesthetics still make sense, and we could deliver a lot on the accessible and beautiful part through Backstage. So this is a little bit of the journey that I want to talk to over in a few slides. So I'll just describe the steps that we had and then like how we went about it. So initially we had an existing console that we decided to replace. And then after that, we did a workshop for planning and scoping. So basically using this workshop, we decided that we want to solve the problem of usability, discoverability, and then reduce fragmentation. And through these points, we want to achieve the goal, which was like builder satisfaction. So this was, I think, roughly about December 2019, somewhere January 2020. So, but early in 2020. So during this step, this is when the pandemic strikes, and then it forced all of us to go full remote. And then a lot of our plans had to consider the fact that everybody was working remote, and things did go well. I mean, we were initially concerned about like how we would plan and work on the stuff, but then we immediately adapted to remote work, and then it did not change our roadmap by too much. And then we had the Backstage release. So I think this was we were evaluating multiple technologies for this. And this was the time around like Backstage made a public release of the software. And then we decided to make use of Backstage to develop our platform. And then what we did was we had a hack week to create a proof of concept, which we can then to show the other developers and our organization that it was possible to build something based on Backstage. So I think if I recall correctly, we did some search plugins and a couple of other plugins just to have a proof of concept based on Backstage. And so once we did, it was during this time that we also incorporated one of our other teams, and the other team was also able to provide a proof of concept. This is when we decided this was like a really viable strategy to create the developer console as a platform. So what we did was we, based on our ideas, we decided to deliver our application as a platform in which other providers can provide their plugins. and drive the adoption of Sunrise within Zalando. And that's when Backstage Alpha was released. So it went from being just a public open source project to an alpha project, and a lot of things got stabilized. And this was around the time as well when we were able to make we had to make a lot of improvements and changes and get Backstage integrated well with Zalando's software landscape. And then we finally decided to name the project Sunrise, because at this point we knew that we had something viable that we could release and then also onboard other providers as well. We did an MVP release, I think, at the end of March. So right now we're officially in production, and we have driven adoption with providers as well as users. Yes. So this is, for example, our homepage. This is, I wanted to show a video, but then I couldn't get time and also like enough clearances. But this is our customized homepage. As you can see that we have, for example, widgets that connect us to GitHub Enterprise. And these are widgets contributed by other teams from our company. So we have a team code, which is, for example, takes care of our GitHub Enterprise integration. And they provided these widgets, which give you an overview of all the pull requests and all the pipeline activities. So I want to talk about the challenges that we had. And this slide, so there are a few points that I want to discuss. So what were the challenges we faced when we started with Backstage? So first challenge was we was a small team. We were, I think, like 4 developers. So it was a little hard because there was like a lot of work to do. And then it was not possible. A lot of things was, we had a lot of things to do, and then we only had a limited time. So it was quite a challenge for us to get things done with 4 developers. And the team was largely unfamiliar with TypeScript. I think at the starting point, there was only one person who knew JavaScript. The rest of us had come from different backgrounds, such as Ruby, Go, Clojure, etc. So we had to like get on board with TypeScript, understand all the technologies involved, and then work on Backstage. And the third problem was Backstage was also under heavy development. There was like a lot of changes going on every day. You make you pull the latest update from Backstage Master. There were like a lot of changes, and then we had to like keep constantly refactor and then like pull the updates and then make sure that nothing breaks. And, yeah. And some of the abstractions and improvements were not well defined. For example, a lot of the things kept evolving. Like Backstage also was also in heavy alpha. So every day the abstractions kept improving. And then when the abstractions improved, you also had to like refactor your code as well to make use of the improved abstractions. And as a result, we had to have a lot of throwaway code and temporary workarounds. So every time something changed, we knew that we had to change to this, but then to solve the problem temporarily, we had to have like throwaway code and like, temporary fixes. And tooling and dependencies. So one of the most interesting things is for a person who is not a JavaScript TypeScript developer, the sheer amount of tools that involve in the JavaScript ecosystem can be overwhelming. And we had to like figure out like what are the tools we need, what are the tools we don't need, like how do we optimize this, how do we configure them and keep our dependencies from becoming too big. But the biggest challenge was collaborating with other teams. Like since this is a mono repo, we had to figure out like what are the best ways to collaborate with other teams in terms of code, in terms of pull requests. How do we share code? How do we share our knowledge, documentation, and how do we ensure that we work towards a common goal? So this was a very interesting challenge, and I think we had to we solved it pretty nicely. One of the greatest learning was it was possible to collaborate with other teams in a mono repo and have a very high quality software. So, and what helped in our journey? So Backstage core members were extremely helpful. So working on Backstage, filing issues on the chat, it was a very positive experience because every time we had some concerns, we had some doubts, there was always somebody ready to help. So I cannot thank the Backstage core members enough. It was a really nice opportunity to work with you all, and your feedback and your constant help was really, really useful. And types are amazing, especially when working on large code bases. So one of the things that that we had a problem with, like on Mosaic, was that JavaScript, while it's a very nice, while it has improved a lot, dynamic languages are really hard, especially when you have large code bases to work with, because you have to like have a lot of tests just to ensure that you are setting some properties, getting some properties, And when things change, you don't know what changes or what changed or how it changed. So types are really important because you know what's going in and what's going out. So TypeScript was a huge boon, especially when you're working on a project with people from different teams and over long lifetimes. And the core abstractions are very solid. For example, entities, the way entities are designed, the idea of plugins and how plugins provide APIs, they're extremely well thought out. And because of that, since the contracts are solid and sort of flexible, it made evolving the code much easier. And we did a lot of iterative development. Sometimes we were making like 5-6 deployments per day. And what we did was every time we had to push a feature, we would just break it down into small parts. And then we would make these changes, deploy, and then test, and then deploy again. So this really reduced the amount of time we would spend building the wrong thing. And then we got instant feedback and well-defined goals and achievables. So we had a clear idea of like what we wanted to build and what we wanted to release. And then we build towards that goals. So if you know what you want to build, it makes the process a lot easier. And the most important part for us for Backstage was it was community driven, which means a lot of contributions were accepted from the community. And then there were a lot of times when we noticed that there was a bug and then we wanted to file an issue. And before we could, when we pulled the latest version of a branch from master, the issue was already fixed. It was amazing because the problem, you realize that you're not the only person running into a problem, and others will also notice and fix this as well. So to us, this is one of the biggest advantages of using Backstage, was that there was not just us, but hundreds of other developers who are ready to help and actually help in many cases to solve problems. So learnings. Even with a small team, it is possible to deliver a lot of value. So because of the fact that it's community driven, a lot of things are already done. All we had to do was like figure out the APIs, figure out like how to compose things and put them together. So even with the small things, we were able to get a lot of things done. And from a project management perspective, if you have well-defined outcomes and clear deadlines, it's very possible to adapt yourself. I mean, the thing is like the human brain and mind is really capable of, once you have a deadline and you have a goal, we're very much capable of like finding the right solution and getting something up and working. And contract first design, the fact that we have APIs and schemas allow us to evolve the code around them. And it's important to get the basic core abstractions correct, namely schema and the APIs. And leverage types to keep code size from being a problem. So I would encourage using TypeScript's biggest feature, which is types. And because basically once you have types, it's very easy to understand like what goes in, what goes out, and how to use them. And trust first approach. I think this was a very good learning for us, because when we previously we still have microservices. So in microservices, everybody has these boundaries, which are your APIs. And then as long as like things are out, so as long as the thing is like microservices became popular for a reason, because every team wants to control their particular piece of software. Here, since it's a mono repo, we did not want to like gatekeep each and every pull request. We don't want to like make our other teams wait around while we review each and every line of code. So what we did was we had a trust first model where we said, okay, we are all working towards the same goal, and we trust that you are doing the right thing. So we will let you make changes, and only if something breaks or if something goes really bad, then we take a look at it. But this is really important because software has gotten quite complex these days, and there's not a lot that one can achieve by oneself, even as a team. So you have to trust the other people and work towards a common goal. And a contribution guidelines on the principle and policy of contribution is very important. So one of the things that we did when we onboard other teams was we had a contribution guidelines documentation, multiple documentation, both on the vision and also on how to contribute. And this guidelines set like clear expectations on like how to contribute and what is the implicit model that we work under. And this really, really helped us all build the software correct, build good software. Yes, so what are the next steps? So the next steps are basically, we are going to be onboarding more teams to provide more tooling through Backstage in Zalando. And this is primarily in the forms of documentation. So there's a lot of features that we provide. And we'll also be targeting a lot of teams which might not have full-time front-end engineers, for example, or for whom Node.js and TypeScript might be unfamiliar territory. So we need to provide them with a lot of documentation on how to do things. And we're also targeting providing plugin templates so that a lot of the instrumentation need not be done by them, but is provided automatically. For example, you just have to execute a script which creates a plugin with built-in analytics and metrics, and it's all integrated into the Zalando software ecosystem. And that's the first step. And second step is also shaping the software landscape at Zalando. What we noticed was that we were able to provide better ways to categorize the software within Zalando. For example, application components and domains are a really good way to classify and then like group software. And so we're using that to drive also the landscape within Zalando. And what Backstage also provided is an excellent platform for productizing the infrastructure offerings. Like previously, people would build their own UIs over whatever infrastructure they provide, Kubernetes or databases, for example. Through Backstage, what we can do is like we can expose those offerings as a product. Like it's not just a bunch of scripts or a web page anymore, but it's a proper software product. And through this, we can have well-defined versions where we can track features and other, basically making things a little less script, making it more of a product and less of a script. That's the best way to describe this. And of course, so we're also we would be nowhere close to where we are now without the community. So we're also looking to contribute back to the community, and the areas that we identified where we could contribute because we have experience here is basically instrumentation, identity, traceability, and a lot of improvements to the catalog, and also documentation. I think documentation and catalog would be some of the biggest things that we can contribute back. And we're looking forward to collaborating with you guys in the future about this. Yep, so that brings me to the end of my presentations. Please feel free to ask me questions on the chat or directly on via audio.
This is amazing. Thank you for sharing, dude. Particularly interesting to see your learnings there, and then your thoughts on the community jumping in and kind of helping and collaborating was awesome. We do have some questions in the chat already. So Taras has asked, how do you do testing?
It's an interesting, testing. So testing is a little, I wouldn't say tricky. So there are different levels of testing. For example, one is you write unit tests for your components. And also there are other forms of testing like smoke tests and integration tests. But then the question is not just tests that you write, but then also for the code that your providers are presenting. So for example, if there's a team that contributes a plugin, who's responsible for testing it? Are you or them? So we're still evolving this narrative. We don't have like a specific answer for this yet, but right now what we do is like providers are responsible for their code, which means that if you're providing code, then you're also responsible for providing tests for it. Right now, we don't mandate any code coverage or minimum test requirements, but the idea is like eventually people know that what to test and what not to, and then they take ownership. So we trust them to do the right thing, and through this trust, hopefully they will know what to write tests for and what not to. But from a platform perspective, we are improving the tests. We have a basic unit tests and some integration tests for what we provide, notably identity, authentication, etc. So for those, we have tests.
Cool. Next question down also from Taras. What was the collaboration with other teams like?
So there are different, as I said, like the skill set offered by different teams vary a lot. Like there are some teams who have like developers familiar with TypeScript and JavaScript and Node. And there are a lot of teams which don't have any full-time front-end developers, for example. So we're still trying to address those questions. So the initial set of teams that we collaborated with, we had people who had they had dedicated front-end engineers and people familiar with JavaScript, so it was not too hard to pick up. But over the forthcoming months, we will be interacting with a lot of teams that don't have full-time front-end engineers, for example. So we're going to use this opportunity to figure out how best to interact with them. So then maybe share this later. So it's still an evolving question. Okay,
Magnus asks, what parts, if any, have you kept from Mosaic 9 and why?
Well, so the thing is, there's a project called Skipper from Mosaic 9. So Skipper is basically sort of like you can think of it as an Nginx or a proxy server. And Skipper solves a lot of problems. So for example, Skipper has dynamic routing, which is amazing. And it's pretty fast. And also it can be integrated well into Kubernetes. So we still use Skipper. Right now, we don't use it on Sunrise Backstage. But Skipper is extremely widely used inside Zalando, and we might incorporate Skipper into Sunrise Backstage as well in the future. Right now, we don't have a use case, but when we do, we might.
Cool. Okay. Francesco asks, how many dev teams in Zalando are using Sunrise these days? And how many of them do you plan to bring on board in the future?
Well, from the perspective of a provider, notably as a provider is a team that provides tooling through Sunrise. Probably we have 4 or 5 at the moment. I think we would go up to maybe 10, 15 this year. But as in the number of people we are serving through Sunrise, it's probably about 2,000 developers or something. I don't know exactly what the headcount is, but it's roughly in the low thousands, if I recall correctly.
Cool. Tony asks, for the homepage, were there any challenges in customizing or things we should watch out for?
On the homepage, was pretty, I wouldn't say challenging, but then there were a lot of interesting problems that came up. So for example, composing widgets and how do you lay out the widgets? For example, I think giving an order of like which widgets are important and which ones do we put on the home screen and which one, and the layout was pretty, was a problem that we had. So right now there are only like 2 teams which have widgets on the front page. It's not a problem, but in the future, the interesting question is like, what are the widgets that we should provide on the front page and how do we let users customize it? So I think that's something that maybe you have to watch out for. I don't know if there's features on Backstage about like being able to customize widgets on the front page, but hopefully that's one use case that we're intending to solve. Notably that users should be able to choose the widgets that they want to show on their homepage.
Cool. And then the last question we have, and then we'll start throwing questions at you. So Marian mentioned, you mentioned a challenge being that your last console was difficult to contribute to for backend devs. Is Backstage/Sunrise easier for your backend devs? Is it still pretty heavy on JS dev?
It is still a little bit challenging, especially for the front end. I mean, on the back end, especially with TypeScript, it's not, it is easier because it's your traditional request response server model. And with TypeScript, it's a lot more easier because you have the types, you have interfaces. It's closer probably to Java than JavaScript in that sense. On the front end, it's not about the language, but it's about being able to understand React components and how to plug them in. So it's so that is pretty challenging. We are trying to address the problem in multiple ways. Either see, for example, maybe we might be able to do the implementation for them ourselves, or we could ask developers from other teams to contribute. For example, if you have a front-end developer who has, like, say, bandwidth to help with another team, then maybe they can help the other team bring up a UI. But we're also trying to address the problem by providing a plugin template where it's easy to just make small changes to tweaks to the code and then, like, you know, have your own UI up and running soon. So it's still a problem that we are, we don't have a proper answer yet, but we're hoping to solve in the next few upcoming months.
Oh, great stuff. Thank you very much for sharing it. That was really interesting to see. Okay.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Yeah, so I'll hand back control.
Cool. Okay, so let's take the opportunity just to have a look what's next on the agenda, and then we'll jump from the issue into other questions and topics that people have in the meeting itself. So the next one down on the issues list is looking forward to asking questions about RBX Future. I apologize, this comes from, is it Aussie Alien? Have I got that right? I'm not sure if you're here with us, but I'm going to throw this one to the maintainers. Can you give us any more details about RBX Future? And then if anyone else has any questions, please throw them in the chat or ask them.
So we can talk a little bit about ideas we have for possibly some access control on top of the catalog, where we've kind of thinking that namespaces is the answer to that right now, that access to catalog namespaces could be restricted based on users. We're not sure in exactly what form, if it's RBAC or something else, but most likely that's where we could see some form of access control implemented.
So we've got a question in the chat from Taras. How do you make it flexible? Taras, I don't know if you can give more context.
Oh yeah, I just I mean every company, I mean every authorization system is different, and every company is different. It's just like, how do you make something that is flexible enough to actually fit every every company's scenario without it being its own project?
So we probably don't try to implement that entire system, right? I think especially when it comes to kind of limiting access to backend routes and those kind of things as well, we're really looking for ways to allow people to plug in their own thing in whatever way we can do that. And of course, it's not a solved problem yet. But that's really that we won't. It's very unlikely that we'll be trying to build, a full kind of role management system or anything like that. That would be sourced from outside of Backstage, if that exists.
Is there an RFC for this somewhere, or any RFC started about this?
The closest one I would say is Organization V2. That's kind of the one where most of the organizational kind of data discussions perhaps are going on, and it's a piece that kind of needs to be solved before we can expand on how we actually then restrict those identities. Can try to find a link and put that in the chat in a second.
The 4089 from identity to ownership V2. Yeah, it's pinned at the top of the issues list.
There we go. Is there any other questions on like RBAC or identity or any of that side of stuff? I don't know if the original poster from the comment in the issue is here as well, but is there anything anyone else wants to ask on this topic?
Would it be possible to get well, I mean, I'll let someone else ask a question, but if there's but keep my eye for the end. But is it possible to maybe kind of go through high level the RFC and see what the current thoughts are, like of what the approach might be?
So I can maybe chime in here, because this is one problem that we are intending to solve, hopefully. So for identity, so the thing is, identity is a little tricky, because having one identity is fine, but then the problem starts coming in when you have more than one identity and then you want to map an identity to other people. So, and I think the way we're planning to solve this right now is like when we emit the Backstage identity token, we sort of have the information on the identity mapping. Like, this is a user authenticated by my company's auth implementation, and what is this identity mapped to in other systems? For example, you might have a username in GitHub Enterprise, you might have a username in another system. So this part is, I don't think, is something that Backstage can provide, but as in the implementation that we wrote, like, we have code that does that. And I think there's a pull request, if I recall correctly, which takes this result of the authentication and then maps it to something else. There was a PR that introduced a function which can be provided when the auth provider is initialized. So, but this I think has to stay custom per implementation, because there's no easy way to solve it, because every company has their own way of doing this.
Yep, I think that's pretty much it. And indeed, I linked the PR in the chat as well. I'll try to not get too much in the weeds, but I can mention as well that we probably go for having that identity token list all of your kind of identities that you can own things through. So if you're a member of a couple of different groups that might be owners of components, that would be listed in the token too. So no kind of going to the catalog to resolve what kind of groups identity would be part of. When you're authenticating a request, you'd only have to look at kind of the groups that you're allowed to access and what's in the token.
Yeah, so the way we set up is like after once we authenticate, then we don't look up in the catalog yet, but looking up in the catalog happens after the authentication. So maybe we just use it for storing the associations, and then you have access to the associations once you're authenticated, and that's part of the token.
Okay, cool. I'm just checking to see if there's any more questions in the chat. If anyone's got any other, before we pick another one from the agenda, if anyone has any topics or questions or anything they wanted to raise, feel free to add it in the chat or speak out if you're interested. And if not, we'll go back to the agenda and pick the next topic down. So we've had a question come in from Dan RS. How do you approach engineering user research at Spotify? How often do you do it? And in what form does it take? I can see we have Austin on this call, so I'm going to pick on him. If you're up for, Austin, just talking about that a little bit.
Sure, I'm happy to. So yeah, we approach engineering user research at Spotify, honestly, just the same as we would approach it for consumer products, to be honest with you. So we have within teams building tools for engineers. We have designers, we have engineers, we have data scientists who are basically focused on building almost commercial worthy or consumer worthy products for our internal engineers. So for us, user research comes largely in the same forms you would expect if for the Spotify mobile app or whatever. So we do it qualitatively and quantitatively. So we have quarterly surveys that go out. That's one thing. An engineering satisfaction survey that we use to sort of measure sentiment over time. That's not something we send to everybody every quarter, just to be clear, because we would probably get yelled at. But we send it to a small sampling every quarter and track trends over time. We also do very focused user research studies. So we'll dig into either a particular job to be done by a developer and go deep, interview a bunch of people and assess really what are the opportunities here, or we'll do it across a domain, really do about, I guess, almost 2 years ago now, we did a really deep study on what is the mobile engineering lifecycle look like? How can we improve it? Really thinking back from first principles, what can we do here to evolve that experience? So the short answer is we do it the same way we do it for consumer user research. We just have the benefit of usually working much more closely with the customer, if you will, or the person or the group that we're researching. Hopefully that answers the question. Happy to go into more detail or clarify anything if you have, Dan.
No, thank you. That was a great answer. Thanks very much.
Okay, and Jarek has a follow-up about the product management. Do you use any kind of user activity analytics in-app in Backstage at Spotify?
Yes, we do. So we have Google Analytics that we look at for our internal Backstage install. It's something we track pretty closely. It's always very competitive to see which golden paths are both the most used and gone through most efficiently. So those are two metrics that we do look at quite a bit in particular. But yes, we do track that data We do, especially if things aren't discoverable, that's something where we lean on that data quite heavily. So yeah, it's we treat Backstage internally just like we would treat Spotify.com.
Cool. And then we have Tavis has asked, what contributions are needed as a community? What can we do to help? Has joining the project to the CNCF changed anything for the core team? So I think I can talk to the second half, and I'm going to open it up for the maintainers and probably you as well, Austin, around the first part. But for the second part, has joining the project to the CNCF changed anything for the core team? Yes, as in I think it's brought lots of different perspectives and kind of experience from people involved at the CNCF and kind of the communities therein, just like within this community for Backstage. I think all of that experience and everything has been a lot of help. And I know personally from kind of, as we internally have talked about CNCF and what does it mean to be in the sandbox, and what do we think about progressing, what do we need to do to progress through the CNCF levels. Having those people at the CNCF, having those people in the communities around is super helpful. Has it changed anything practically within the teams? I don't think it has too much, to be honest. We were committed to the project always anyway, through working at it, and we still are. And I think it's just the scope that the project has. Being part of the CNCF, I think, has widened the impact that we can have and build out that community. For the first part of that question, as a community, what can we do to help? I'm going to open that up to the maintainers and for Austin and others from Spotify here. Where do we need help? Where do we think the community can help us?
I can talk to a little bit of this. I can also say, back on the CNCF stuff, is that the CNCF through sandboxing stages are very hands-off. Like, they don't get involved at all, really. As the project grows a little bit further and goes through the different stages, maybe they get more involved, but like they're totally hands-off right now and just letting us do our thing and letting us grow a community. In terms of how the community can help, like, we try to keep track of tickets and apply good first issues, and all these help wanted ticket labels on them. They're a good place to start, I think, just kind of going through those tickets and having a look what you maybe can pick up to help us out with the small contributions. On a bigger scale, like, the RFCs are super important, because internally, like, we built it one way to support Spotify's use case, but if we just release that, it wouldn't work for 99% of people, because that's our use case. So we want to collect feedback from ideas that we're having to try and get an understanding of how people use or want to use the product, and like what we need to kind of understand internally, what we need to build. And then out the back of those RFCs come tickets, and then we go and often implement them. I think that's probably what I would recommend. I don't know if anybody else has any other, maybe Austin, you want to shout, or Patrick?
I could jump in, but just one thing real quick. One thing I want to make sure of is that, like, we don't just think about contributions as code. The contributions to the community can be so much more or take so many different forms than code. So all I wanted to add to Ben's comment is, like, just engage in community sessions. Tell us what's broken. Tell us what we can improve. Just tell us what works. Sometimes it's really nice to hear that something works, especially when you spend a bunch of time on it, and share your experience with Backstage with others. I think there's so much more than just contributing code, just contributing documentation that really will make the community grow and make it really successful. So just don't think about just code and documentation is the only thing I'd add.
Okay, cool. And then we have another question, and then we'll go back to the agenda, I think, to see what's on there next. We've only 10 minutes or so to go. So Pallavi asks, on the question of golden path, how can Backstage track whether a golden path is used efficiently?
I can answer that one super quick. Two things in particular. One, we will look at session data over time and just see how long people are actually spending in different stages of the golden path. The other is we do when folks onboard, which is when the golden path is usually used in like really high concentration. We do sort of track that over the course of a boot camp. So there's a week or so boot camp when engineers join Spotify where they spend time in the golden paths, and we'll track sort of how efficiently different disciplines get through the different golden paths. So sort of one quantitatively and one a bit more qualitatively.
Cool, thanks, Austin. Okay, looking back to the agenda for today, the next topic down that we had was from Tony, is it Tony Tam, is that right, I think? And he was asking about, we'd love to hear about how companies have deployed Backstage on Kubernetes, or if they don't deploy using Kubernetes, how are you running your deployment? So this is definitely one that we can talk to as to what we do at Spotify. But before we do that, I'm wondering if there's anyone else in the community would like to share on that one.
I can chime in as well. So we also deployed through Kubernetes. So we have, I think, a different we have one deployment across both, but then we run the front end and the back end as different containers, and we push more or less the same configuration of the stuff, but then it's all running on Kubernetes, and then we have some custom operators which help us do the routing of the requests and the domain names, etc. But maybe if you have any specific questions about how we deploy in Kubernetes, I think I can be of a little bit more help, because it's just we just use standard Kubernetes deployments at the moment.
I can comment. We use Kubernetes as well, and I started off originally with the Backstage Helm chart that's in the contrib. Then I ended up like pulling out a bunch of stuff, and then putting stuff back in when I realized what it did. So, but we now use kind of a modified version of it, because we have our kind of a customized secrets injection mechanism. And we have some internal Helm charts that are used for that are shared. So we're using internal Helm charts, and one of our original POC was to run everything as one container. We still have that right now, but we're going to split it up into multiple containers and probably do a lot of polish on the Helm charts that we use, because it's one of the things I want to integrate into the workflow is scaffold, to make it easier for developers to spin up their own versions of Backstage and then have like service previews. So that's one of the areas I'm looking at a lot, is how to use scaffold to, well, we're already using it, but I want to make it a bigger part of developer workflows.
Cool. I don't know if one of the maintainers can talk to just briefly how it's deployed at Spotify, maybe.
A quick description. So I guess a big difference is that generally the plugin backends are deployed and scaled independently, all of them, more or less. So it's a multitude of backends in the, I don't know exactly what count, but 30s, 40s, something like that. So the backend part of it is very they're very separated from each other and communicating with each other in the backend. Front end, very similar. It's we use the Nginx image deployment method. We do fallback, so there is this when you load dynamic chunks, you kind of need a fallback for that. So we have a fallback for GCS, and kind of storing old builds of the front end in GCS to fall back to that.
I have a quick question on how you scale up, I guess, plugins. And so the backends for plugins developed by other teams. So if I understand correctly, you have a proxy that allows you to proxy request to the appropriate backend. When you update the core Backstage platform, does that affect the other plugins or other teams that have deployed their own plugins and backends? Or can you update them independently for the most part?
It's generally very low impact on other plugins when we do updates. And there's a couple of layers sitting in front of the proxies, or load balancing layer in front of the proxy, kind of making sure that requests in some cases are retried and so on too. So deployments it's very rare that we see some impact there.
Okay, so we're quickly approaching the end of the session, about 5 minutes or so to go. We're going to drop in a feedback request form into the chat as we go through this last few minutes. So keep your eye open for that and please provide any feedback so we can make these sessions better. But before we wrap up, are there any other topics or quick questions in the last few minutes that anybody wanted to ask?
Lee, can I mention open mic now?
Go for it. Sure.
So we have I'm going to drop a link in chat. It's we have a new meetup that we started to kind of to complement the Backstage sessions. We have the Backstage open mic, and the goal of this meetup is to give a space for the kind of the user-land implementations of all the things that kind of because there's such a variety of different use cases, and so we want to be able to talk about those use cases. So one of the things that so we had we had an event a couple of weeks ago, and we have a next one coming up on May 5th. It's a similar format to what we have here, and so these events are going to be kind of right between the Backstage sessions. So on this upcoming event, I'm going to be talking. I want to host a conversation about versioning things and representing versions of things. It's a question that keeps coming up in Backstage support and general chat. So if you're interested in that, I'm looking for a few panelists who are interested in talking about versioning things. So that'll be a conversation with me, and I'm also looking for someone to talk about either setting up authentication or setting up authorization with what exists today, or there was one other topic. Well, also like examples of deploying things on Kubernetes, or any kind of hands-on demo of an aspect of Backstage, to give everyone an opportunity to kind of talk about technical things. So so that's happening in 2 weeks, and everyone's welcome to join.
Thanks for sharing, Taras. One last thing to call out as well, it is KubeCon Cloud Native Con is coming up at the beginning of May. And just to draw attention, on May the 5th, on the Wednesday, we actually have one of our own Spotify engineers from what's called the Pulp Fiction Squad. They look after tech docs in Backstage. Emma is going to be giving a talk on Wednesday, and the talk is called Tech Docs Unlocking the Potential of Engineers' Collective Knowledge. And that's Emma Indal, one of our engineers here at Spotify. So I just wanted to kind of highlight and say congratulations, Emma, and good luck, and for people to go check it out. Cool. That brings us to the end of today's session. I don't know, Himanshu, if you're still here, do you have the link for, I've got the feedback form, I found it. Please check out, I'm just dropping the link into chat. There's a feedback form for today's session. Thank you everybody for joining, and looking forward to seeing you all soon in the next one. Bye for now.